My name is Dr. David Mitchell, and for the past 15 years, I've been digitizing historical photographs for the National Archive Project. I've examined thousands of portraits from the Victorian era, each one telling its own silent story of lives long forgotten. But nothing in my career prepared me for what I discovered last Tuesday afternoon, when a routine digitization session turned into something that would challenge everything I thought I knew about photographic history. I was working through a collection donated by the estate of Margaret Whitmore, a prominent Boston family whose patriarch had been a successful merchant in the late 1800s. The photographs were typical of the period. Formal family portraits with stern-faced subjects staring directly into the camera, their expressions frozen in time by the lengthy exposure requirements of early photography. As someone who has spent years studying these images, I can usually identify the approximate date, location, and even the photographer's studio just by examining the lighting techniques and compositional elements. The photograph that caught my attention was labeled simply as Emma Whitmore, age 12, studio portrait, 1897. At first glance, it appeared to be a standard portrait of a young girl from a wealthy family. She wore an elaborate white dress with intricate lacework and pearl buttons, her dark hair arranged in carefully styled ringlets that framed her pale face. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, and she gazed directly at the camera with the serious expression typical of children's portraits from that era. But there was something about Emma's eyes that made me pause. Unlike the vacant stares common in photographs of that period, her eyes held a depth that seemed almost modern, as if she were looking not just at the camera, but through it, directly at me across the span of more than a century. I found myself studying her face more closely, noting the delicate features and the slight upturn of her lips that suggested she might have been fighting back a smile despite the photographer's instructions to remain solemn. Using our high-resolution scanning equipment, I began the routine process of digitizing the image, adjusting the contrast and brightness to bring out details that might have faded over time. The photograph was in remarkably good condition, with only minimal yellowing around the edges and a few small spots that could easily be corrected digitally. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something familiar about Emma's face, though I couldn't place where I might have seen those features before. It wasn't until I began cataloging the metadata for the digital file that I noticed something unusual in the collection notes. According to the estate documentation, Emma Whitmore had been the only child of Charles and Adelaide Whitmore. The family had lived on Beacon Hill in Boston, where Charles operated a successful importing business. Emma had been educated by private tutors and was known in their social circle as a gifted pianist who often performed at charity events hosted by her mother. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. As I continued processing the Whitmore collection, I came across another photograph buried deeper in the stack. This one was labeled Studio Collection, Photographer Unknown, circa 1897. It showed what appeared to be the same young girl, wearing an identical white dress with the same carefully arranged ringlets and the same direct gaze. But this photograph bore no identification, no family name, no indication of who the subject might be. My first thought was that someone had simply mislabeled one of the photographs, that both images were of Emma Whitmore taken during the same studio session. It wouldn't be unusual for a wealthy family to commission multiple portraits of their child, perhaps to send to relatives or to display in different rooms of their home. But as I examined the two images side by side on my computer screen, I began to notice subtle differences that made me question that assumption. The lighting in the second photograph was slightly different, suggesting it had been taken in a different studio or at a different time of day. The background, while similar in style, showed minor variations in the painted scenery that Victorian photographers often used as backdrops. Most significantly, the girl's expression, while remarkably similar, held a slightly different quality. Where Emma's eyes seemed to hold a hint of mischief, this second girl's gaze appeared more melancholy, as if she carried some unspoken sadness. I spent the next several hours comparing every detail of the two photographs, Using digital analysis tools to measure facial proportions, examine the fabric patterns of the dresses, and analyze the photographic techniques used in each image. The more I studied them, the more convinced I became that these were not two photographs of the same child, but rather portraits of two different girls who bore an uncanny resemblance to each other. The implications of this discovery began to dawn on me as I delved deeper into the Whitmore family history. According to genealogical records, Charles and Adelaide Whitmore had indeed had only one child, Emma, who was born in 1885. There was no mention of twins, no record of another daughter, no indication that the family had ever been involved with adoption or fostering. Yet here I had photographic evidence of what appeared to be Emma's identical twin, a girl whose existence seemed to have been completely erased from the historical record. I decided to expand my research, reaching out to other archives and historical societies that might have records relating to my research. Whitmore family, or to photography studios operating in Boston during the 1890s. What I discovered over the following weeks would fundamentally change my understanding of this case and raise questions that I'm still struggling to answer today. The breakthrough came when I contacted the Boston Historical Society about their collection of Victorian-era photography. Dr. James Crawford, their chief archivist, was intrigued by my inquiry and agreed to search their holdings for any images that might be related. 3 days later, he called me with news that sent chills down my spine. Hidden in a collection of photographs donated by a local church in 1952 was another portrait that matched the style and apparent date of Emma's photograph. This image showed a young girl who appeared to be the same age as Emma, wearing a similar but not identical white dress. Her hair was styled in the same ringlets, and her facial features were so similar to Emma's that they could have been sisters. But this photograph bore a different name: Lucy Hartwell, age 12, 1897. Dr. Crawford had done some preliminary research into the Hartwell name and discovered that Lucy had been a resident of the Boston Home for Foundlings, an orphanage that operated in the city's South End during the late 19th century. Unlike Emma Whitmore, who had grown up in luxury on Beacon Hill, Lucy Hartwell had been abandoned as an infant and raised in the institutional setting of the orphanage. The existence of Lucy Hartwell raised profound questions about the relationship between these two girls. How was it possible that two children who appeared to be identical twins had ended up in such vastly different circumstances? Had they been separated at birth? Was one of them adopted by the Whitmore family while the other was left at the orphanage? Or was there some other explanation for their remarkable resemblance? As I continued my investigation, I began to uncover more photographs that seemed to be connected to this mystery. In archives across New England, I found portraits of young girls who bore striking similarities to both Emma and Lucy. Some were identified by name and family. Others were anonymous studio portraits with no indication of who the subjects might have been. Each discovery added another layer to what was becoming an increasingly complex puzzle. The photographic evidence suggested something that challenged conventional understanding of Victorian family structures and social norms. These weren't simply cases of children who happened to look alike. The similarities were too precise, too consistent across multiple images and different photographers. There was a pattern here, a systematic occurrence that hinted at something much larger than coincidental resemblance. What made the mystery even more intriguing was the discovery that many of these photographs had been taken in different cities across the Northeast. While Emma's portrait had been taken in Boston and Lucy's at the orphanage in the same city, other similar images had been captured in studios in New York, Philadelphia, and Hartford. The geographic spread suggested that whatever was happening, it wasn't confined to a single location or photographer. I began to develop theories about what might explain these extraordinary similarities. Perhaps there had been a network of photographers who specialized in creating portraits of children for families who had lost their own daughters. Maybe there was a systematic practice of separating twins at birth, with one child being placed with wealthy families while the other was sent to institutions. Or possibly these images represented something even more unusual, something that would challenge our understanding of photography itself during that era. The more I researched, the more questions arose. Why had some of these children been photographed multiple times by different studios? What was the significance of the year 1897, which appeared repeatedly in the dating of these portraits? And most puzzling of all, why did so many of these images seem to have been deliberately separated from their original family collections, ending up in archives and institutions with little or no identifying information? As I prepared to present my findings to the National Archive Project Committee, I realized that I had stumbled upon something far more significant than a simple case of mistaken identity or mislabeled photographs. The pattern of similarities, the geographic distribution, and the systematic nature of how these images had been preserved and cataloged suggested a story that had been deliberately obscured, a mystery that someone had gone to great lengths to keep hidden. The question that haunted me as I compiled my research was whether I was looking at evidence of a forgotten chapter in American social history, or if these photographs represented something else entirely, something that would challenge our understanding of what was possible in the world of Victorian photography and family life. The committee meeting where I presented my initial findings was met with a mixture of fascination and skepticism. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the project director, listened intently as I displayed the photographs side by side on the conference room screen. Her expression grew more serious as I walked through the evidence I had compiled over the past month. "Sarah, what you're suggesting has significant implications for how we understand Victorian photography and social practices," she said, adjusting her glasses to get a better look at the images. "But we need to be absolutely certain before we draw any conclusions. Have you considered the possibility that these are simply examples of the standardized portrait techniques that were common in that era?" I had anticipated this question and had prepared additional evidence to address it. Over the following weeks, I expanded my research methodology, employing advanced digital analysis techniques that hadn't been available to previous researchers studying Victorian photography. Using facial recognition software originally developed for law enforcement, I began mapping the precise measurements and proportions of each girl's features. The results were startling. The facial mapping revealed that these weren't simply children who looked similar due to shared fashion trends or photographic conventions. The measurements showed mathematical precision in the similarities, particularly in the spacing between the eyes, the curve of the lips, and the angle of the jawline. These were statistical anomalies that couldn't be explained by coincidence or the standardized practices of Victorian portrait studios. But the technology also revealed something else that had been invisible to the naked eye. When I enhanced the resolution of Emma Whitmore's original portrait, I discovered faint marks along the edges of the photograph that suggested it had been altered in some way. Using spectral analysis, I could detect traces of retouching that had been done with remarkable skill for that time period. Someone had deliberately modified aspects of the image, though the purpose of these alterations remained unclear. This discovery led me to examine all of the related photographs with the same enhanced techniques. In nearly every case, I found evidence of subtle modifications. Sometimes it was the background that had been altered. Other times it was small details in the clothing or jewelry. In a few instances, there were signs that facial features had been slightly adjusted, as if someone had been working to create specific similarities or differences between the subjects. The implications of these findings were profound. If these photographs had been systematically altered, it suggested that someone had been deliberately creating or manipulating the resemblances I had discovered. But why would anyone go to such lengths to produce these images? And what did it mean for the historical record if some of our most treasured Victorian portraits had been artificially modified? My investigation took on a new urgency as I began to trace the origins of these photographs more carefully. I started mapping the network of photography studios where these portraits had been created, looking for connections between the photographers, their techniques, and their clientele. What I discovered was a web of relationships that spanned multiple cities and involved some of the most prominent photography studios of the era. The central figure who emerged from this research was a man named Augustus Blackwood, a photographer who had operated studios in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia during the 1890s. Blackwood had been known for his innovative techniques and his ability to create remarkably lifelike portraits that captured not just the physical appearance of his subjects, but seemed to reveal something of their inner character as well. What made Blackwood particularly interesting was his background. Unlike most photographers of his era, who had learned their craft as apprentices in established studios, Blackwood had studied art and chemistry in Europe before returning to America to establish his photography business. His technical knowledge was far advanced beyond that of his contemporaries, and he had developed several proprietary processes for developing and printing photographs that he kept closely guarded as trade secrets. As I delved deeper into Blackwood's career, I discovered that he had maintained detailed records of his work, including notes about his clients and the techniques he had used for specific portraits. These records, preserved in the archives of the New York Public Library, provided crucial insights into how these mysterious photographs might have been created. Blackwood's notes revealed that he had been experimenting with what he called composite portraiture, a technique that involved combining elements from multiple photographs to create idealized images. He had developed methods for seamlessly blending facial features from different subjects, allowing him to create portraits that met his clients' specific desires for how they wanted their children to appear. The notes also indicated that Blackwood had been working with a network of associates who provided him with reference photographs from other cities. This explained how portraits taken in different locations could share such precise similarities. Blackwood and his colleagues had been systematically creating what amounted to a catalog of idealized childhood images that could be customized for wealthy clients who wanted their children portrayed in specific ways. But the records also hinted at something darker. In several entries, Blackwood made cryptic references to special commissions that required absolute discretion and involved subjects who must remain anonymous. These commissions appeared to pay significantly more than his regular portrait work, and they often involved creating multiple versions of the same image with slight variations. One entry from November 1897 was particularly intriguing. Blackwood wrote about receiving a commission to create a series of portraits depicting the same subject at different ages and in different circumstances. The client, identified only as Mrs. W., had requested that these images appear to show different children while maintaining specific facial characteristics that were important to her. The timing of this entry coincided perfectly with when Emma Whitmore's portrait had been taken. Could Mrs. W. have been Adelaide Whitmore, Emma's mother? And if so, what could have motivated her to commission such an unusual series of photographs? As I pursued this line of investigation, I discovered records showing that Adelaide Whitmore had indeed suffered multiple miscarriages before Emma's birth. Medical records from her physician, Dr. Theodore Ashford, documented a history of pregnancy losses that had left her emotionally devastated. Could the mysterious portraits have been Adelaide's way of imagining the children she had lost, creating visual representations of the daughters who might have been? This theory gained support when I found correspondence between Adelaide and her sister, Margaret, discussing Adelaide's struggles with what we would now recognize as complicated grief. In one letter dated 1896, Adelaide wrote, "I cannot help but wonder what they would have looked like, how they would have grown, what kind of young ladies they might have become." The emotional context provided by these letters suggested that the portrait series might have been Adelaide's attempt to fill the void left by her lost children. By commissioning Blackwood to create images of girls who resembled Emma but represented different possibilities, different paths her lost daughters might have taken, she could maintain a connection to the children she had never been able to raise. However, this theory couldn't explain all aspects of the mystery. Why had these portraits ended up in orphanages and institutional collections? How had they become separated from their original context within the Whitmore family? And what accounted for the geographic spread of similar images across multiple states? The answer to these questions came from an unexpected source. While researching Blackwood's business practices, I discovered that he had been involved in what was essentially an early form of stock photography. He had created a library of portrait images that could be purchased by families, institutions, and organizations for various purposes. Wealthy families who wanted to display portraits of idealized children in their homes could purchase these images. Orphanages and founding homes used them to create fictional family histories for children in their care, giving them portraits to treasure as if they depicted real relatives. Some families even used these images to replace portraits of deceased children, finding comfort in having idealized representations to remember their lost loved ones. This commercial aspect of Blackwood's work explained how images that had been created as custom commissions for one family could end up in the collections of institutions hundreds of miles away. It also accounted for the systematic nature of the alterations I had detected. Each image had been modified to suit the specific needs of its ultimate purchaser while maintaining the core characteristics that made it part of Blackwood's catalog. But even with these discoveries, fundamental questions remained unanswered. The level of technical sophistication required to create such convincing composite portraits seemed almost impossible given the photographic technology available in 1897. How had Blackwood achieved such seamless results using the primitive equipment and chemical processes of his era? The answer to this technical puzzle came from a discovery that would fundamentally change how I understood not just Blackwood's work, but the entire landscape of Victorian photography. Hidden in a collection of scientific papers at Harvard University, I found research conducted by Dr. Cornelius Hartwell, a chemistry professor who had been experimenting with photographic emulsions during the 1890s. The surname immediately caught my attention, given that Lucy Hartwell, the orphaned girl whose portrait had started this investigation, shared the same name. Dr. Hartwell's research focused on developing what he called malleable emulsions, chemical compounds that could be manipulated after the initial exposure to alter specific aspects of a photograph. His laboratory notes describe techniques for selectively bleaching or darkening portions of an image, methods for combining multiple exposures on a single plate, and processes for creating what he termed phantom impressions that could overlay one image onto another with remarkable precision. The connection between Dr. Hartwell and Augustus Blackwood became clear when I discovered correspondence between the two men dating from 1896 to 1899. Hartwell had been supplying Blackwood with experimental chemicals and providing technical guidance for the photographer's more ambitious composite projects. In exchange, Blackwood had been testing Hartwell's innovations in real-world applications and documenting the results. One letter from Hartwell to Blackwood, dated March 1897, contained detailed instructions for a process he called spectral layering. This technique involved creating multiple exposures on specially treated glass plates, with each layer containing different elements of the final image. When properly developed, these layers would merge into a single photograph that appeared completely natural to the naked eye but contained elements that had never existed simultaneously in reality. The implications of this discovery were staggering. Blackwood hadn't simply been retouching photographs in the conventional sense. He had been using cutting-edge chemical processes to create entirely new images from component parts, combining facial features from different subjects, merging backgrounds from various locations, and even incorporating elements that had been photographed at different times. The portraits I had been studying weren't just altered images. They were sophisticated constructions that pushed the boundaries of what was technologically possible in the 1890s. This revelation led me to reconsider everything I thought I knew about Emma Whitmore and the other children whose portraits had initiated this investigation. If Blackwood had been capable of such advanced manipulation, could Emma herself have been a composite creation? Was the girl in that first portrait a real child at all? Or was she an idealized construction built from multiple sources? To test this theory, I began analyzing Emma's portrait using techniques borrowed from forensic photography. I mapped the lighting patterns across different areas of her face, looking for inconsistencies that might indicate composite construction. I examined the grain structure of the photographic emulsion, searching for variations that might reveal where different elements had been combined. I even studied the chemical composition of different areas of the print, using spectroscopic analysis to identify variations in the silver content that might indicate multiple exposures. The results were both fascinating and disturbing. The analysis revealed that Emma's portrait showed signs of being constructed from at least 3 different source images. Her eyes appeared to have been taken from one photograph, her nose and mouth from another, and her hair and clothing from a third. The seamless integration of these elements demonstrated a level of technical mastery that was almost unbelievable for the 1890s. But if Emma was a composite creation, what did that mean for the Whitmore family records that documented her existence? I returned to the genealogical archives with new questions, looking not just for evidence of Emma's life, but for proof that she had existed at all. What I discovered challenged everything I thought I knew about Victorian record-keeping and family documentation. The Whitmore family records, which had seemed so comprehensive and reliable, contained subtle inconsistencies that became apparent only when subjected to intense scrutiny. Birth certificates that should have been filed immediately after Emma's birth were dated weeks later than they should have been. Medical records from her childhood showed gaps and irregularities that were unusual for a family of the Whitmores' social standing. Even the family's social calendar, meticulously maintained by Adelaide, showed curious omissions during periods when Emma should have been participating in children's events and gatherings. Most significantly, I found no photographs of Emma with other children or family members. Every image of her in the Whitmore collection was a solo portrait, despite the fact that wealthy families of that era typically documented their children's interactions with siblings, cousins, and friends. It was as if Emma had existed in complete isolation, never photographed in the company of anyone who might later contradict the story of her existence. The possibility that Emma Whitmore had never existed as a real child opened up even more disturbing questions about the other portraits I had discovered. If Blackwood and his associates had been creating fictional children for wealthy families, what did that say about the nature of family, identity, and memory in Victorian society? How many other historical photographs in our archives might actually be sophisticated fabrications? I decided to expand my investigation beyond the Whitmore case, looking for other families who might have commissioned similar work from Blackwood's network. Using the techniques I had developed for analyzing composite portraits, I began examining other Victorian family collections, searching for signs of the advanced manipulation techniques that Hartwell's research had made possible. The results were shocking. In archive after archive, I found portraits that showed evidence of composite construction. Wealthy families across New England appeared to have been purchasing idealized images of children who had never existed, incorporating these fictional offspring into their family histories and passing them down as authentic family heirlooms. The scope of this practice suggested something far more systematic than individual families dealing with grief or loss. There appeared to have been an entire industry built around creating fictional family histories for the wealthy elite, providing them with photographic evidence of the perfect children and family relationships that reality had failed to deliver. But why would families participate in such elaborate deceptions? What social or psychological needs were being met by these fictional portraits? And how had such a widespread practice remained hidden from historical scrutiny for more than a century? The answers to these questions began to emerge as I studied the broader social context of the 1890s. This was a period of rapid social change, when traditional family structures were being challenged by industrialization, urbanization, and changing women's roles. Wealthy families, in particular, faced increasing pressure to maintain appearances of domestic perfection, while dealing with the realities of high infant mortality rates, frequent pregnancy losses, and the social stigma associated with childlessness. For families like the Whitmores, who had suffered multiple pregnancy losses, Commissioning portraits of fictional children may have served as both a private comfort and a public shield. These images allowed them to present the appearance of successful parenthood, while privately mourning the children they had lost. The portraits became tangible representations of hopes and dreams that had been shattered by the harsh realities of 19th-century medicine and mortality. The practice also reflected the Victorian era's complex relationship with death and memory. Families routinely commissioned post-mortem photographs of deceased loved ones, seeking to preserve their memory through visual representation. The creation of pre-mortem portraits of children who had never lived represented the extension of this practice, allowing families to memorialize possibilities rather than actualities. However, the commercial aspect of Blackwood's operation suggested that the practice had evolved beyond personal grief into something approaching social performance. Wealthy families were purchasing not just comfort, but status symbols that demonstrated their ability to achieve the domestic ideals that their society valued. These fictional portraits became part of an elaborate theater of respectability that allowed families to maintain their social standing, regardless of their private struggles with fertility and child mortality. The discovery that so many historical family portraits might actually be sophisticated fabrications had profound implications for how we understand Victorian family life and social structures. It suggested that the neat, orderly family histories preserved in our archives might be far less reliable than we had assumed, shaped as much by social expectations and commercial interests as by actual lived experience. But perhaps most significantly, it raised questions about the nature of historical truth itself. If families could commission fictional photographs that were indistinguishable from authentic family portraits, how many other aspects of the historical record might be similarly constructed? What other comfortable assumptions about the past might crumble under the kind of technical scrutiny that had revealed the truth about Emma Whitmore? As I prepared to present these findings to a broader audience of historians and archivists, I realized that I had stumbled upon something far more significant than a simple case of photographic manipulation. The Emma Whitmore portrait and its associated mystery had revealed an entire hidden dimension of Victorian society, one where the boundaries between reality and fiction, memory and imagination had been far more fluid than we had ever imagined. The implications of this discovery would extend far beyond the field of photographic history, challenging fundamental assumptions about family, identity, and the reliability of visual evidence that had shaped our understanding of the past. In revealing the truth about one fictional Victorian child, I had opened a window into a world where reality itself had been subject to commercial construction and social performance on a scale that few historians had ever suspected. The presentation I delivered to the International Conference on Photographic History in October sent shockwaves through the academic community. As I stood before an audience of distinguished historians, archivists, and photography experts, displaying the evidence I had compiled over months of painstaking research, I could see the disbelief in their faces gradually transform into fascination and then concern. Dr. Margaret Thornton from the Smithsonian Institution raised her hand during the question period. "Dr. Mitchell, you're suggesting that an entire segment of our photographic heritage may be fraudulent. How can we verify the authenticity of thousands of other portraits in our collections without subjecting every single image to the kind of intensive analysis you've conducted here?" It was a question I had been dreading, because the honest answer was that we couldn't. The techniques Blackwood and his associates had developed were so sophisticated that conventional authentication methods were useless against them. Only the advanced digital analysis tools that had become available in recent years could detect the subtle signs of composite construction that revealed these portraits as fabrications. Following the conference, I began receiving calls from museums and archives around the world. Collections managers who had attended my presentation were returning to their institutions with new eyes, suddenly suspicious of portraits they had displayed and celebrated for decades. The Metropolitan Museum of Art requested my assistance in examining their collection of American Victorian photography. The Library of Congress wanted me to analyze daguerreotypes that had been considered priceless examples of early American portraiture. Even international institutions reached out, wondering if similar practices might have occurred in European photography studios of the same period. But as my investigation expanded, I encountered resistance from unexpected quarters. Several prominent auction houses that specialized in historical photography contacted my university, expressing concern about the potential impact of my research on the market for Victorian portraits. If collectors began to doubt the authenticity of these images, the value of entire collections could be devastated overnight. The pressure to downplay my findings intensified when I received a visit from representatives of the Whitmore Foundation, a charitable organization established by descendants of the original Boston family. Mrs. Patricia Whitmore Ashford, the current family matriarch, arrived at my office accompanied by 2 lawyers and a private investigator who had been researching my background and credentials. "Dr. Mitchell," she began, settling into the chair across from my desk with the practiced composure of someone accustomed to getting her way. "My family has become aware of your recent presentation regarding what you claim to be irregularities in our ancestral photographs. I must tell you that we find your assertions both offensive and potentially libelous." She opened a leather portfolio and withdrew copies of documents I hadn't seen before. "These are Emma Whitmore's school records from the exclusive Miss Pemberton's Academy for Young Ladies. Here are receipts for piano lessons with Madame Volkov, one of Boston's most renowned music instructors. This is a letter of commendation from the pastor of Trinity Episcopal Church, praising Emma's participation in the children's Christmas pageant of 1899. The documents appeared authentic, bearing the appropriate seals and signatures for their claimed dates. But after everything I had discovered about the systematic nature of the deception surrounding Emma's existence, I found myself questioning whether these records might also be fabrications, created to support a fictional identity that had taken on a life of its own. "Mrs. Whitmore Ashford," I replied carefully, "I understand your concern about protecting your family's reputation. But the photographic evidence I've uncovered suggests that the portrait of Emma may not be what it appears to be. These documents, while certainly interesting, don't address the technical anomalies I've detected in the photograph itself." Her expression hardened. "Dr. Mitchell, my family has been prominent in Boston society for over 2 centuries. We have contributed millions of dollars to charitable causes, supported countless cultural institutions, and maintained detailed records of our genealogy. Are you seriously suggesting that our ancestors engaged in some sort of elaborate hoax involving fictional children?" The private investigator, who had remained silent until this point, leaned forward. "Dr. Mitchell, we've looked into your background. You've been working on this digitization project for 15 years, examining thousands of photographs. Isn't it possible that you've become so immersed in looking for irregularities that you're seeing patterns that don't actually exist? Pattern recognition can sometimes lead to false positives, especially when someone is motivated to find something significant." His implication was clear. They were suggesting that my discoveries were the product of an overactive imagination rather than legitimate scientific analysis. But I had anticipated this kind of challenge and had prepared additional evidence that would be difficult to dismiss. From my desk drawer, I withdrew a folder containing the results of isotopic analysis I had commissioned on samples taken from Emma's portrait. This analysis was conducted by the forensic laboratory at MIT, I explained, handing copies of the report to each of them. They examined microscopic samples of the photographic emulsion from different areas of the portrait. The results show that the silver halide crystals in the area around Emma's eyes have a different isotopic signature than those in the area around her mouth and nose. Mrs. Whitmore Ashford frowned as she scanned the technical report. "What does that mean in practical terms?" "It means that those areas of the photograph were created using silver compounds that came from different sources, possibly even different countries. In a genuine portrait from 1897, the entire image would have been created using chemicals from the same batch, showing consistent isotopic signatures throughout. The variations we're seeing are consistent with a composite image created by combining elements from multiple source photographs. The lawyer whispered something to Mrs. Whitmore Ashford, who nodded grimly. "Dr. Mitchell, regardless of what your tests might suggest, the Whitmore family has legal standing to protect our reputation from unfounded allegations. We would prefer to resolve this matter quietly, but we are prepared to take whatever steps are necessary to prevent the publication of research that could damage our family's legacy." After they left, I sat alone in my office, contemplating the implications of what had just occurred. The Whitmore family's reaction suggested that my discoveries threatened something more significant than just their ancestral pride. Their willingness to bring lawyers and investigators into the matter indicated that there might be financial or social consequences to the revelation that Emma had never existed. But their visit had also revealed something else important. The documents they had produced, while potentially authentic, actually supported my theory rather than contradicting it. If the Whitmore family had indeed commissioned a fictional portrait of Emma, they would naturally have needed to create supporting documentation to maintain the illusion. School records, music lesson receipts, and church commendations could all have been fabricated or manipulated to provide a paper trail for their fictional daughter. The existence of such elaborate supporting documentation actually made the deception more impressive rather than less so. It suggested that the creation of fictional family members in Victorian society had been a far more sophisticated operation than I had initially imagined, involving not just advanced photographic techniques, but also the systematic creation of false historical records. This realization led me to examine the broader network of institutions that would have been necessary to support such deceptions. Schools, churches, music instructors, and social organizations would all have needed to be complicit in maintaining fictional identities for non-existent children. The scope of cooperation required suggested that this practice might have been more widespread and socially accepted than I had assumed. My research into this institutional network revealed a fascinating and disturbing pattern. Many of the organizations that appeared in the supporting documentation for fictional children, like Emma, were actually connected to Augustus Blackwood's photographic network through financial relationships and shared clientele. Miss Pemberton's Academy for Young Ladies, for example, had been partially funded by several wealthy families who were also known clients of Blackwood Studios. The Academy's records, preserved in the Boston Public Library, showed curious patterns in their enrollment documents. Many students appeared to have attended for very brief periods, sometimes as little as a few weeks, before disappearing from the records without any indication of transfer to other schools or explanation for their departure. These phantom students invariably came from the wealthiest families in Boston society, families who would have had both the means and motivation to purchase fictional family histories. Madame Volkov, the music instructor whose receipt appeared in Emma's documentation, had operated a studio that catered exclusively to the children of Boston's elite. Her appointment books, discovered in a trunk in her former studio building, contained numerous entries for lessons with children whose names appeared nowhere else in Boston's social records. These phantom students seemed to exist only in the context of their music lessons, with no other documentation of their participation in the cultural and social activities that would have been expected for children of their supposed social standing. Even Trinity Episcopal Church, which had supposedly commended Emma for her participation in their Christmas pageant, showed irregularities in their records from the 1890s. The church register contained baptismal and confirmation records for children who appeared to have no other presence in Boston society. Their families were listed as prominent members of the congregation, but these same families often had no other children documented in the church records, despite the fact that large families were the norm for their social class during that period. The pattern that emerged from this investigation was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. It appeared that an entire infrastructure had developed in Boston's elite society to support the creation and maintenance of fictional family members. Photography studios, schools, music instructors, and religious institutions had all participated in an elaborate system that allowed wealthy families to construct idealized family histories that bore little resemblance to reality. What started as a routine digitization of a single Victorian portrait has revealed something far more profound than anyone could have anticipated. Emma Whitmore, the 12-year-old girl who gazed at me from that 1897 photograph with such knowing eyes, may never have existed at all. She was likely a masterful construction, created through revolutionary photographic techniques that were decades ahead of their time, designed to fulfill the desperate longings of a grieving mother and the social expectations of Gilded Age society. The implications of this discovery extend far beyond one Boston family's elaborate deception. We now know that an entire industry existed to provide wealthy families with fictional children, complete with fabricated documentation and institutional support. Photography studios, schools, churches, and social organizations all participated in maintaining these elaborate illusions, creating a parallel world where reality and fantasy became indistinguishable. As historians and archivists, we must now confront the uncomfortable truth that many of our most treasured historical photographs may be sophisticated fabrications. The techniques developed by Augustus Blackwood and Dr. Cornelius Hartwell were so advanced that they've fooled experts for more than a century. How many other Emma Whitmores are sitting in our archives, their fictional stories accepted as historical fact? This case has taught me that the past is far more malleable than we ever imagined. Victorian society, with its rigid social expectations and devastating child mortality rates, created a market for fictional perfection that enterprising photographers were eager to supply. In their quest to maintain social standing and find comfort in their losses, wealthy families purchased not just photographs, but entire fabricated identities for children who existed only in their dreams. The technology that revealed Emma's true nature as a composite creation reminds us that historical truth is not static. As our analytical capabilities advance, we must be prepared to question long-held assumptions about the past. What other secrets might be hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right technology to reveal them? Perhaps most importantly, this investigation has shown us that the human need for connection, for family, for the perfect child who embodies all our hopes and dreams, is so powerful that it can reshape reality itself. The parents who commissioned these fictional portraits were not engaging in mere vanity or deception. They were creating tangible representations of love for children they had lost or could never have, finding solace in images that allowed them to experience parenthood in ways that life had denied them. As I continue to examine other collections for signs of similar manipulation, I'm struck by the poignancy of these fabricated family histories. Each fictional child represents real grief, real longing, real love that had no other outlet for expression. In their own way, these composite portraits are as authentic as any genuine photograph, because they capture something true about the human experience, even if the subjects themselves never drew breath. The girl in that 1897 studio portrait may not have been real, but the love that created her certainly was. And perhaps in the end, that's the most important truth of all.